this video we'll be looking at homeostasis in humans. So we've briefly touched on this topic in the previous video when we looked at the endocrine system and glucose, how that is controlled in the blood, thyroxine, all of those nice hormones. So homeostasis in humans found in paper 1, and it's around 11 marks. So what do you need to know? Once again, the exam guidelines are really nice with providing definitions for you and some extra information that you should be aware of. So let's look at the definition of homeostasis. So homeostasis is the process of maintaining a constant internal environment with narrow limits, despite changes that take place internally and externally. So because of those changes, we need to keep our internal environment constant. Now, the conditions within cells depend on the conditions within the internal environment, such as the tissue fluid. So in the tissue fluid, you'll get different concentrations of, for example, carbon dioxide, glucose, salt, and water. So because of that difference in the tissue fluid, that can trigger the process of homeostasis to try and maintain that constant internal environment. So like I said, the factors that affect it is carbon dioxide, glucose, salt, and then the water concentration, and then temperature and pH must also be kept constant in our internal environment, which is tissue fluid. So homeostasis through negative feedback. So the negative feedback mechanism specifically controls the concentration of glucose, carbon dioxide, water, and salts. Now in this video we are not going to look at glucose again because we looked at in the previous video at the glucose concentration. So in this video alone we'll be looking at carbon dioxide, water, and salts, and then lastly we'll go over to thermoregulation, which is the structure of the skin using a diagram that you should know, and then with an emphasis on the parts involved in thermoregulation. So a role of the following: a negative feedback mechanism. You also need to know how sweating plays a role, vasodilation, and vasoconstriction. So firstly, conditions need to be kept constant for the body to function optimally. So if we look at temperature, your body needs to be at a constant temperature of 37.5 degrees Celsius, because there's a lot of chemical reactions happening in your body, there's enzymes, and we all know that temperature can either accelerate or decelerate a reaction, so that is very important for it to be maintained. Now, the negative feedback mechanism, also touched on it briefly in the previous video. So normal levels of affected changes, so that is like glucose, carbon dioxide, all of those ones we spoke about above, that change is then detected by receptors in your body. Those receptors then transmit info either through hormones or neurons. In this case it would be hormones to effectors. The effectors will correct the change, the normal levels return, and then the receptors detect this and a corrective action is stopped. Let's look at one of the first factors that need to be kept constant, and that is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is detected by chemoreceptors in the aorta that detect a concentration increase of carbon dioxide. So in case you didn't know where those sit, so the aorta, specifically in that area over here, it's difficult to see the red on red, you've got something called the carotid body, and in the carotid body you'll have those chemoreceptors that will send a message to the medulla oblongata. And in the medulla oblongata you would have, for example, the respiratory center. So if we had to look at this in an easier term or way, let me just quickly clear out that section there, and then I'll do a quick drawing for you. So let's say you've got your blood vessel, and then around the blood vessel and the surrounding areas, you've got now, for example, at the aorta, you've got those chemoreceptors. So let's get a different color going. So let's see if my drawings will work. So that is supposed to be a neuron. It's going to help detect these changes. So this then extends all the way. You've got these neurons going up into the brain, where you've got now the respiratory center, for example. So let's draw another one, looking something like that, sticking out. Not the best drawings, but okay, so those are now the respiratory centers in the brain, specifically the medulla oblongata. Now, in the tissue in your body, the tissue fluid specifically, there's going to be carbon dioxide levels that will increase as these tissues build up and function. There's going to be a build-up of this carbon dioxide, for example, with cellular respiration. So there's going to be a high concentration of carbon dioxide. Now, as we know with diffusion, something will want to go from a high concentration to a low concentration, and that will have to happen in the blood, because we know that's how we get rid of it. The blood then takes it to the lungs and we exhale. But let's say there's an extremely high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood already. That means there's a high concentration here and a high concentration there. So that gradient will not occur where it goes from a high concentration to a low concentration. Now, these chemoreceptors will pick up on that, and they will then send a message to the respiratory centers that will, for example, tell your body to breathe faster. So this is how that whole process works. Just a quick drawing of that. So the CO2 concentration increases, the chemoreceptors send nerve impulses to the respiratory and the cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata. The respiratory center sends nerve impulses to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles to accelerate the contraction and relaxation of those muscles. And then the rate and the depth of breathing increases, and more carbon dioxide laden air is exhaled. So cardiovascular center sends nerve impulses to the heart muscles and the arterioles. So the heart rate will also increase, the arterioles constrict and blood flows faster. CO2 is transported to the lungs faster for exhalation, and CO2 concentration in the blood thus returns to normal. So the respiratory and the cardiovascular centers work together, and that's basically just to increase the rate of breathing and increase the heart rate, so that you can get more oxygen in as your breathing rate increases and as your heart rate increases, to get the oxygen in the blood faster and distribute it through the whole body, and to get that carbon dioxide out through exhalation. So that is carbon dioxide concentration in the blood. Now, I just put another reminder here that we already did glucose in the previous video. So now we are going to look at regulation of water content of the blood. And this is done with ADH. So ADH is secreted by the hypothalamus. Now, please don't get confused with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is the one that produces the ADH. Then that ADH is stored in the pituitary gland until it is needed, when it will then be secreted. So just so you know the difference there. Now, let's look at it. When there's a decrease of water content in the blood, so when there's warmer weather conditions, so you are sweating a lot, you might not have enough water, you're stuck in the desert somewhere, then this will be triggered. So when less water is taken in and more is lost, the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are stimulated and ADH is secreted. So this causes the walls of the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts to become permeable to water. So the distal convoluted tubule, this one over there, and then the collecting ducts will start over there. Now, in the tissue fluid surrounding this remember is the nephron in the kidney, just in case you guys forgot. So around it you should have some water in the tissue, but on a warm day that might not be the case. There'll be very little water in the surrounding tissue. So now ADH stimulates these two areas to become permeable to water. So that means we want water to be reabsorbed. So water has been filtered, and it's part of the filtrate that is now making its way through the nephron and will then finally exit in urine. So we want to take the water out of the urine that will just be wasted. And this is why these walls become permeable, so that water can then move in to the tissue fluid in the surrounding area. So water is reabsorbed, the urine becomes more concentrated and the volume decreases. So in the bladder, let me try and draw a bladder here. So in the bladder, the urine, where its normal levels would have been up there, the urine now becomes less and it becomes more concentrated, so a very darker yellow color. So the osmoreceptors also stimulate the thirst center in your body, so more fluid is taken in. So that's why you get thirsty, and then the water content increases and it returns to normal. So then you'll have way more water in the surrounding tissue fluid. So that is on a warm day. Now what happens on a cold day? So this is little water is lost and more is taken in. So the osmoreceptors once again in the hypothalamus are stimulated, less ADH is secreted because we don't want the antidiuretic hormone to be triggered now. So the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts become less permeable to water. So this means that this process here won't happen. Urine is less concentrated and the volume increases. So now you'll have a fuller bladder. It will be a lighter yellow color, and then large amounts of water is excreted in the urine. So this will just continue down without going into the surrounding tissue fluid. And then the water content of the blood decreases and it returns to normal. This is really, it's straightforward stuff. You don't need to worry too much about it. Now, let's look at the regulation of the salt concentration. So with this one, aldosterone is the hormone here, and it is secreted by the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys, and this regulates the amount of sodium and potassium. So sodium and potassium. So when the sodium concentration is too low, aldosterone is secreted and sodium is reabsorbed from the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts into the blood capillaries. The concentration of sodium increases in the blood and fewer sodium is excreted in the urine. When sodium concentration is too high, less aldosterone is secreted, so less sodium is reabsorbed and more is excreted into urine. That's the basic stuff. So if we just look at this diagram that we just looked at now, there's a sodium pump and everything. It can get quite complicated, but once again, if the sodium concentration in the blood is too low, so there's not enough sodium in the blood, then once again these tubules will become permeable and sodium will be pulled out of the distal convoluted tubules in the collecting ducts and then enter the blood. If the sodium concentration is too high, so if there's a lot of sodium in the surrounding tissue, then these will just once again not become permeable and not allow that transfer to happen. So that is the end of carbon dioxide, salt, and then the water concentration. Straightforward stuff. Which means we can now move on to thermoregulation. So you also need to know the structure of the skin and how it plays a role in thermoregulation. So firstly, we are endothermic creatures or endothermic animals. So that means we can regulate our own body temperature regardless of the external environment. Yes, it will trigger us to do certain things and our bodies to do certain things, but we can basically regulate it ourselves. Whereas ectothermic animals such as reptiles, you will know them as cold-blooded, they cannot regulate their own body temperature and they are reliant on the external environment to help them regulate their body temperature. So let's look at this cross-section of the skin. So before we get there, so heat loss in humans occurs either through radiation, convection, or conduction. So radiation is the loss of heat energy from a warm body to a cold environment by means of rays or waves, where convection is when, for example, you've got a direct contact of cold air on your body that will either cool it down or warm it up, so you can get warm air as well. And then conduction is the transfer of heat energy from warm to cold objects that are in contact with each other. So when a person sits on a cold cement slab, for example. Okay, let's get to the skin. So your skin is made up of the epidermis and then the dermis. So the epidermis is made up of 3 layers. So these 3 layers are these ones, so over here and here. So the cornified layer is the first one. So this is the part of the skin that you can actually see where you've got dead skin cells and stuff. And also keratin is found in this layer. Then you've got the granular layer, and then lastly the Malpighian layer, which contains melanin that will give you your skin color, and if you've got lots of melanin you'll be a bit more resistant to the sun. But the main function of these 3 layers of the epidermis is for protection. Then it brings us to the dermis, so the inner pieces or the inner parts of the skin, if you put it that way. So in here you've got, for example, sweat glands, you've got some erector muscles, you've got nerve endings, you've got blood vessels. All of these, sit in the dermis. Now in the dermis you've also got sensory organs. Now on the right hand side, the sensory organs are all of these little bubble-like structures. Now these sensory organs help you to detect stimuli. So there's quite a few of them. So the first one, Ruffini's corpuscles, they detect heat stimuli, so if something is hot. Then Krause's corpuscles will detect cold. The Pacinian corpuscles will detect pressure, and then Meissner's corpuscles will detect touch, and then you've also got free nerve endings that will detect pain. So free nerve endings that sit in the epidermis, and then you've got Ruffini, Meissner, and the Pacinian. Who are we missing? Krause. So can't see it now, but not on this diagram. So you need to know which of these corpuscles detect what kind of stimuli. Let's look at how our bodies regulate their temperature. So on a cold day, what happens? Krause's corpuscles detect a change and converts it to a nerve impulse sent to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends impulses to the involuntary muscle layer and the walls of the skin's blood vessels, and vasoconstriction occurs. So the blood vessels constrict. So if we look at this, you've got a whole bunch of blood vessels scattered throughout your skin, and this actually comes into quite narrow contact with the outside. So if it's a cold day, what's going to happen if you look at this diagram, in your blood vessels, they've also got muscles. So this is a normal blood vessel, and this one is then a vasoconstricted. Can you see that it narrows the area of where blood can flow to? So what happens is it goes further away from the surface, and that means that less heat is lost either through radiation, convection, or conduction. So vasoconstriction occurs. So the blood vessels constrict. Blood is redirected to blood vessels in the deeper skin layers, so less blood flows to the surface and less heat is lost. So less blood flows to the sweat glands as well, so less sweat production, so no evaporation to cool down skin. So looking at the sweat gland, it will secrete sweat to the surface, and on a hot day it will pull up, and when that sweat evaporates, the water from the sweat evaporates, it cools down the skin. On a cold day, there's less blood supply in the specific area to the sweat gland, which means less sweat will be produced, so there will be no evaporation that takes place to cool down the skin even further, which is what you do not want. Then, erector muscles also receive an impulse, causing hair to become erect, trapping air. Less heat is lost. So these erector muscles, it's this shaft you can see over here, excuse me. So what happens is this erector muscle pulls on the base of the hair, and as it pulls it, this hair will become erect. It will go stand upright, and so will all of these others. And when you get goosebumps, it's actually because of this erector muscle pulling. That is what goosebumps are. Now, when all of these hairs stand erect, that means that air gets trapped in this space between the hairs, and that will mean that less air is or less heat is lost then. So that's on a cold day. On a hot day, Ruffini's corpuscles detect a stimulus and convert it to a nerve impulse that is once again sent to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, my biology teacher always spoke of the hypothalamus as big mama. Are you cold? Are you thirsty? So the hypothalamus is like a big mama taking care of its children. So the hypothalamus then sends an impulse to the involuntary muscle layer in the walls of the skin's blood vessels. So vasodilation occurs, so the blood vessels widen. So more blood flows to the skin surface and heat is lost. So it's just the opposite of vasoconstriction, which we see here. So vasodilation, this is a normal blood vessel, but look how much more open the blood vessel becomes. And this allows blood to come closer to the skin surface, much like you would open a window to let hot air out. So will the blood vessels open up so that they can lose the heat that is being carried in the body. So more blood flows to the skin surface and heat is lost. Then more blood to the sweat glands. So secretion occurs, resulting in an increased sweat production, and that sweat production will also lead to evaporation, so more heat is then lost. The erector muscles are not activated and the hair will lie flat. Now, what else happens? So increased heat production. So on a cold day, what can happen? The muscle tone of voluntary muscles are increased, so then shivering occurs. That's why you shiver. Your muscle tone is increased and then shivering occurs. That shivering means that your muscle cells require more energy, so the respiratory rate increases and more heat is produced. That shivering action actually produces heat. There'll also be an increase in thyroxine being released from the thyroid. This will raise your metabolic rate and more heat is also produced there. And then you can also have behavioral activities such as putting on warmer clothes, drinking hot drinks, or eating warmer food. That can also increase your body temperature. Now, if we want to decrease in heat production, so on a hot day, the voluntary muscle tone is decreased, so that shivering action does not happen, so requiring less energy. There will be a decrease in thyroxine production, so you have a decreased metabolism, so less heat is made. So on a hot day, your metabolism will have a decreased rate. And then you also have behavioral activities such as wearing cooler clothes, drinking cold drinks, and moving to a cooler environment if you're lucky to have an air conditioner in your home, or just sitting in front of the fan. And that is the end of homeostasis in humans. Not too bad, just a lot of studying work, so good luck.